The Funnies, number 6, with a cover date of March 1937, came from Dell Comics. This issue had a record-setting 88 different strips and features in it. Some of the highlights include Dan Dunn's Secret Operative 48 and a one-page story from Norman Marsh, Tailspin Tommy, a two-page story from writer-artist Hal Forrest, Myra North, Special Nurse, and a two-page story from Ray Thompson and artist Charles Call. Sheldon Mayer gave us a scribbly story. Bob Moore wrote Tad of the Tanbark with artist Carl Pfeiffer, and that team up also worked on Scissor Sketches and Don Dixon and the Hidden Empire. Funny Pages number 9 came out from Comics Magazine with a cover date of March 1937. The Photojournal Guide to Comic Books calls this issue rare, giving it a Gerber 8 rating. Will Eisner's story and art was featured, as well as a Victor Dowling cover art. The Clock Strikes was a two-page story from writer-artist George Brenner, featuring the first masked hero in comic books. Funny Picture Stories from Comics Magazine had a cover date of March 1937. Terror of the Timber was the cover image from artist Clyde Eden. Clyde Eden, who often signed with Clyde Dawn, was a comic book artist during the 30s and 40s. His early work including Centaur titles like Forbidden Island, Stubby, and Terror of the Timber. He drew funny animal features and Trinket for Timely Comics, Dum Dum the Clown for Consolidated Book, and Stubby and Trinket for Dell Publishing. In 1948, he did a feature called The Mighty Bunyan for Bell Syndicate. King Comics number 12 had a cover date of March 1937, published by David McKay Publications. It featured a Joe Musial cover, Jack Burnley art. Some of the highlight characters include Popeye, Flash Gordon, G-Man, Mandrake the Magician, and King of the Royal Mounted. There is a mile-high copy from the Edgar Church collection, one of the earliest books in that collection. Mickey Mouse Magazine, number 18, cover dated March 1937, came out from Western. It is volume 2, number 6. 36 pages with a 10-cent cover price and a Minnie Mouse cover. Some of the highlights include Wisecracks, edited by Donald Duck. It's a text story with art by Otto Mesmer. Born August 16, 1892, lived until October 28, 1983, an American animator best known for his work on the Felix the Cat cartoons and comic strip produced by the Pat Sullivan Studio. Feline Follies starred Master Tom, a black cat who is a prototype to Felix. Felix was the first cartoon character created and developed for the screen, as well as the first to become a licensed mass merchandise character. Sullivan took the credit for Felix, and though Mesmer directed it and was the lead animator in all the episodes he appeared in, Sullivan's name was the only on-screen credit that appeared in them. Mesmer also oversaw the direction of the Felix newspaper strip, doing most of the pencils and ink on the strip until 1954. Felix the Cat starred in over 150 cartoons until 1931, when animation studios began converting to sound films. The newspaper strip popularity began to fade in the 30s, though the character was reintroduced to new fans via comic books in the 40s. Mesmer also produced more Felix comic books in the 40s and 50s. Mickey Mouse Comics was a one-page story from writer Ted Osborne with art by Floyd Godfredson. Arthur Floyd Godfredson, born May 5, 1905, lived until July 22, 1986, an American cartoonist best known for his defining work on the Mickey Mouse comic strip. He has probably had the same impact on the Mickey Mouse comics as Carl Barks had on the Donald Duck comics. Walt Disney Productions hired Godfredson in 1929. In April 1930, he started working on the 4-month-old Mickey Mouse comic strip, which had originally been scripted by Walt Disney. In May, Disney had Godfredson assigned to the daily strip, and Godfredson continued to produce the Mickey Mouse strips for the next 45 years. Godfredson's first daily strip was published in newspapers on his 25th birthday in 1930. In 1932, he began work on the newly inaugurated Mickey Mouse Color Sunday strip, which in addition to the daily, he continued through mid-1938. Originally, Godfredson drew the strips alone, but in 1934, he pulled back to plotting the stories and doing the penciling. Scripts were written by Ted Osborne from 1934 to 49. Godfredson continued illustrating the daily strip until he retired in 1975. Silly Symphony Comics was a one-page strip from writer Ted Osborne with pencils by Al Taliaferro. Charles Alfred Taliaferro, born August 29, 1905, lived until February 3, 1969. Known simply as Al Taliaferro, a Disney Comics artist who produced Disney comic strips for King Features Syndicate. Taliaferro is best known for his work on the Donald Duck comic strip. Many of his strips were written by Bob Karp. Taliaferro started his career lettering the Mickey Mouse strips in 1931 and drew the Bucky Bug comics in 1932, as well as Silly Symphonies from 1932 to 39. Taliaferro co-created a number of characters including Huey, Dewey, and Louie, Grandma Duck, and arguably Daisy Duck. He drew Donald Duck comic strips from 1938 until his death in 1969 in California. More Fun Comics 19, cover dated March 1937, was from DC Comics, featuring such highlights as Dr. Occult from Siegel and Schuster. The cover art was Spike Spaulding by artist Vincent Sullivan. The Dr. Occult story ran for 2 pages from Siegel and Schuster under the alias of Leaguer and Ruths in their fantasy supernatural story. Pep Morgan appeared in a 2-page story from writer-artist Craig Flessel, and Flessel also worked on Thrilling True Stories, a 2-page story from writer Richard Speed, and Bradley Boys was written and drawn by Craig Flessel. Siegel and Schuster gave us a second title, Radio Squad, running 2 pages in their detective mystery. And one of the highlights of this issue is an advertisement on the back page for Detective Comics #1. New Adventure Comics #14 had a cover date of March 1937, published by DC Comics. Whitney Ellsworth did the cover, featuring Kids and Crooks. There's a mile-high copy from the Edgar Church collection, one of the earliest comics he ever owned. Craig Flessel wrote and drew The Adventures of Steve Conrad in a 2-page story. Jungle Fever was a 4-page story, which gave us the jungle characters Red and Curly. And it was written and drawn by Ed Winiarski. Ed Winiarski sometimes signed his work Win or Winnie. Winiarski's earliest known feature is the 4-part story Jungle Fever, which he wrote and drew in New Adventure Comics 14, 15, 16, and More Fun Comics #22, all in 1937, published by National Comics, the future company DC. Winiarski additionally drew and probably wrote the Charlie Chan-like Asian Private Eye feature Mr. Chang in Detective Comics #2. These were among the first of 100 story credits he would compile for the future DC Comics. By 1941, Winiarski was also drawing for the company's Quality and Hillman periodicals. His first known credit for Timely Comics was art for the 2-page filler All Winners, a story that was also one of future Marvel legend Stan Lee's first comic works in All Winners Comics #1 in 1941. As both writer and artist, he created the early superhero humor feature The Vagabond in USA Comics #2, continuing it in the next 2 issues, and in Young Allies Comics #4 and Comedy Comics 11, as well as the single appearance crusading journalist feature Powers of the Press, starring reporter Tom Powers in USA Comics #3. Also for Timely, Winiarski also wrote and drew such humor features as The Creeper and Homer, Oscar Pig, Millie the Model, Hetty Divine. For Timely's 1950s successor, Atlas Comics, he drew numerous horror and suspense stories for anthologies including Strange Tales and Journey into Mystery, while creating other titles such as Buck Duck, who was featured in It's a Duck's Life. In 1958, Winiarski did some work for Major Magazine's mad-like satiric magazine, Cracked. Detective Sergeant Carey of the Chinatown Squad was a 2-page story, written and drawn by Joe Donahue. The detective mystery featured Detective Sergeant Carey. Joseph Donahue, born 1911, lived until 1964. He was a Golden Age artist who, for National and DC, he made Detective Sergeant Carey from 1937 to 41. He also drew the Fearless Fellows feature in Novelty's Blue Bolt comic book in 1944 through 1947. Siegel and Schuster gave us a 4-page Federal Men detective mystery story introducing the new villain Blackie Flint. Popular Comics number 14, with a cover date of March 1937, came from Dell Comics. Characters include Dick Tracy, Harold Teen, and the Gumps, and artists include Sheldon Mayer. Some of the highlights include a 4-page Dick Tracy story from writer-artist Chester Gould, Little Orphan Annie in a 3-page story from writer-artist Harold Gray. Gray also gave us Ma Green in another story. Milton Caniff gave us a 3-page Terry and the Pirate story, and Tom Mix is featured in a 2-page story. Credits are unknown, but an early appearance of the character. Tip Top Comics number 11, with a cover date of March 1937, was published by United Feature Syndicate. It featured Tarzan on the cover. It was the cover feature, and youngsters in 1937 were surely lured by the promise of a Tarzan pinup inside, and the strip reprints came from Hal Foster.